The rain hammered against the reinforced glass of St. Jude's emergency bay like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry god, a relentless, deafening rhythm that matched the frantic heartbeat of the hospital itself. Lightning sheeted across the Seoul skyline, illuminating the sleek, black convoy of armored SUVs screeching to a halt at the ambulance entrance. Tires smoked against the wet asphalt, the smell of burnt rubber mixing instantly with the metallic scent of ozone and the impending stench of blood. The automatic doors hissed open, forced apart not by sensors, but by the brute strength of men in soaking wet, expensive suits, their eyes scanning the perimeter with the predatory focus of wolves. In the center of the chaos, a stretcher was hauled out of the lead vehicle, surrounded by a phalanx of bodyguards shouting in Korean, their voices cutting through the clinical sterility of the intake station. At the heart of the commotion lay a man whose suit alone cost more than the average surgeon's annual salary, now ruined by a dark, blossoming stain spreading across his abdomen. Dr. Park, the hospital's terrified medical director, sprinted down the hallway, his loafers skidding on the polished linoleum. He was a man accustomed to boardroom politics, not the visceral reality of gang warfare spilling into his lobby. He skidded to a halt as a massive bodyguard, a man built like a tank with a scar running through his eyebrow, shoved a gun into his chest. "We need the best," the bodyguard roared, his Korean harsh and guttural. "He is dying. If he dies, everyone in this building dies. Do you understand?" Dr. Park trembled, his glasses slipping down his nose as he looked at the patient. He recognized the face immediately. Everyone in the city did, though usually only in whispered rumors or blurred paparazzi photos. It was Kang Dae-hyun, the shadowy head of the Magumwa Syndicate, a man who controlled half the shipping lanes in the Pacific. And he was bleeding out on Dr. Park's floor. I will call Dr. Choi. He is the head of trauma," Park stammered, reaching for his pager. The bodyguard slapped the device out of his hand, the plastic clattering across the floor.
"No."
"Boss said the best. The absolute best. We know who works here. We know who you have hidden away in the archives because she was too good for your fragile egos." The bodyguard leaned in, the barrel of the weapon pressing painfully into Park's sternum. "Get Dr. Kamara." Now Park's face drained of color. The request was impossible, or at least politically suicidal. Dr. Zuri Kamara had been disgraced, relegated to pathology and research after the scandal 5 years ago, a scandal orchestrated by powerful men to protect their own. Calling her up to the OR wasn't just a breach of protocol, it was an admission that the hospital's entire hierarchy was a lie. But as the monitor hooked to Dae-hyun began to scream a high-pitched warning, beep beep beep, Park realized he had no choice. The thunder crashed outside, shaking the foundation, as Park turned to a nurse, his voice barely a whisper. "Page Dr. Kamara. Tell her the devil is calling in a debt." The basement of St. Jude's was a different world entirely, a place of humming servers and the cold, quiet dignity of the morgue, far removed from the hysterical panic of the ER upstairs. Dr. Zuri Kamara sat under the pool of light from a microscope, her long, elegant fingers adjusting the focus with practiced, microscopic precision. She was 29, though her eyes held the weary wisdom of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes. Her skin was a flawless, deep mahogany that seemed to absorb the stark fluorescent lighting, and her hair was pulled back in strict, utilitarian braids that highlighted the sharp, aristocratic lines of her jaw. She was beautiful, objectively so, but it was a beauty armored in ice. She hadn't touched a living patient in 5 years. Not since the trial. Not since the evidence vanished. Not since she was branded reckless to save a senator's son from a malpractice suit. She adjusted the slide, the silence of the lab her only companion, until the red emergency light on the wall began to pulse. It wasn't just a light, it was the catastrophic code. The all-hands override. Zuri ignored it. She was a pathologist now. Emergencies were for the living, and she dealt in the dead. But then the intercom crackled, breaking the silence with a desperate, breathless plea. "Dr. Kamara.
Please."
"This is Director Park. They're going to kill us. Come to Trauma 1. Immediately, Zuri paused, her hand freezing over the microscope. Park never called her. Park barely acknowledged her existence in the cafeteria. For him to beg meant the situation wasn't just critical, it was apocalyptic. She stood up, her movements fluid and deliberate. She didn't rush. Panic was for amateurs. She stripped off her lab coat, revealing the black scrub she still wore out of habit, and walked to the elevator. As the metal doors slid shut, enclosing her in the mirrored box, she watched her own reflection. She looked calm. She looked ready. But deep down, a tremor of intuition warned her that the past she had buried in this basement was about to claw its way back up to the surface. The elevator dinged on the ground floor, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The air smelled of iron and ozone. Zuri stepped out, and the sea of frantic nurses and terrified residents parted for her. It was a reaction born of respect and fear. They remembered how she used to operate. She walked with a stride that ate up the distance, her gaze fixed straight ahead. 2 armed men moved to intercept her, but she didn't even slow down. "Move," she said, her voice a low, smoky contralto that carried more authority than a shout. The men, confused by her sheer audacity, hesitated, and that was all the time she needed to breeze past them into Trauma 1. The room was a slaughterhouse of activity, shouted commands, and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. In the center, surrounded by a chaotic swirl of incompetence, lay the patient. Zuri stepped up to the table, snapping on blue nitrile gloves with a sharp thwack. "Status," she barked, not looking at the face yet, focusing on the wound. "Gunshot, upper right quadrant, probable liver laceration, tension pneumothorax. Why hasn't this chest been decompressed?" She grabbed a scalpel from a tray, ignoring the trembling resident holding it. "Tube," she commanded, slicing into the chest cavity with a precision that was terrifying to watch. A hiss of air escaped, and the patient's vitals stabilized slightly. Beep, beep, beep. The rhythm slowed. Only then did she look up. Only then did she look at the man whose life she had just snatched back from the edge. She froze. The scalpel hovered in the air. The sounds of the ER, the shouting, the thunder, the machinery, faded into a dull roar. Lying on the table, pale and covered in sweat, was Kang Dae-hyun, the man who had testified against her. The man whose lies had stripped her of her license, her reputation, and her life. His eyes fluttered open, fighting the shock, and locked onto hers. The recognition was instant. The arrogant, powerful Mafia boss looked at the woman holding the knife, and for the first time in his life, Kang Dae-hyun looked utterly terrified. The silence that descended on Trauma 1 was heavier than the lead apron used in radiology. It was a suffocating, pressurized vacuum where the only sound was the mechanical hiss of the ventilator and the rhythmic thump-thump of the monitor tracing Dae-hyun's struggling heart. Zuri stood over him, her hand steady, but her mind reeling with a 5-year-old rage that tasted like bile. This was the man who had sat in a deposition chair, looking impeccable in an Armani suit, and calmly explained to a medical board that Dr. Kamara had been negligent, that she had been drunk, that she was the reason the senator's son had died on the table. It was a lie. He had been the one who forced the surgery in an unsanitized safe house. He was the one who delayed transport. But his money and his influence had painted a different picture, and she had been the canvas for his masterpiece of deceit. "You," she whispered, the word carrying more venom than a scream. Dae-hyun's lips moved, dry and cracked. He was trying to speak, but the oxygen mask fogged with his shallow breaths. His hand, stained with his own blood, twitched upward, reaching toward her, or perhaps trying to ward her off. The giant bodyguard stepped forward, sensing the shift in the doctor's demeanor, and raised his weapon, aiming it directly at Zuri's temple. "Fix him," the thug growled. "If you stop, I blow your brains out." The threat hung in the humid air, gross and violent. The other medical staff cowered, diving under desks or pressing themselves against the tiled walls. Director Park was weeping silently in the corner. But Zuri didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the gun. She kept her eyes locked on Dae-hyun, her dark eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and professional obligation. "If you shoot me," Zuri said, her voice terrifyingly calm, "he dies in 3 minutes. His hepatic artery is nicked. He's bleeding internally at a rate of 500 milliliters a minute. There isn't another surgeon in the city who can navigate that damage without killing him. So go ahead. Pull the trigger. Be the man who killed Kang Dae-hyun. She turned her head slowly, glaring at the bodyguard with such ferocious intensity that the massive man actually took a half step back. Put the gun away. Get out of my operating theater. Or I walk away and let him drown in his own blood. It was a bluff. She had taken an oath, and despite everything, Zuri was a doctor first and a victim second, but the bodyguard didn't know that. He looked at his boss. Dae-hyun gave a microscopic nod, his eyes pleading. The bodyguard lowered the weapon. Clear the room, Zuri ordered, snapping back into command mode. I don't need an audience. I need a scrub nurse who doesn't shake and an anesthesiologist who knows how to handle a hypotensive crisis. Everyone else, out. The room emptied in a flurry of white coats and expensive suits, leaving Zuri alone with her demons and her patient. She looked down at Dae-hyun, her mask hiding the grim set of her mouth. You destroyed my life to save yourself, she murmured, leaning close to his ear as she prepared the clamp. And now the universe has a sense of humor. Because I'm the only thing standing between you and hell. She didn't wait for a response. She signaled the anesthesiologist. Put him under. Deep, as the drugs flooded his system and his eyes rolled back, Zuri felt a strange, cold clarity. She would save him. Not for him, but to prove that she was still the best. And once he was well, she would make him pay. The surgery was a war of attrition waged on a battlefield of flesh and bone. For 4 hours, Zuri Kumara was not a woman, not a victim, not a disgraced employee. She was a machine of supreme competence. The operating theater lights beat down like a desert sun, sweat beading on her forehead, instantly wicked away by the scrub nurse she had handpicked. The damage to Dae-hyun's internal organs was catastrophic. The bullet had tumbled, shattering a rib and tearing through the liver before lodging dangerously close to the inferior vena cava. One slip, 1 millimeter of trembling hesitation, and he would bleed out instantly. The monitor kept it steady, rhythmic vigil, the soundtrack to her performance. Beep, beep, beep. Suction, Zuri commanded, her voice flat. More. I can't see the bleeder. The blood welled up, dark and viscous, obscuring the surgical field. She reached in, her gloved hands moving with the grace of a concert pianist and the brutality of a butcher. She could feel the pulse of the great vessel against her fingertip, thrumming like a trapped bird. This was the competence porn that the hospital legends were built on, the sheer, unadulterated skill that made Zuri Kumara a prodigy before the fall. She visualized the anatomy in 3D within her mind, seeing past the blood, past the tissue, understanding the architecture of the body better than she understood her own heart. Clamp, she snapped. The metal clicked. The bleeding slowed. Suture. 4-0 proline. As she stitched the liver, her mind involuntarily flashed back to 5 years ago. The rain had been falling then, too. She remembered the safe house. She remembered Dae-hyun standing over her, holding a phone, ordering the cover-up while she frantically tried to resuscitate the boy he had put in danger. He had looked at her then with cold detachment, weighing her value against his empire and deciding she was expendable. Now, she held his liver in her hands. She could crush it. A simple squeeze. A surgical complication. Who would know? The thought was intrusive, seductive, and terrifying. Her hand hovered for a fraction of a second. I could end it right now. But then the monitor skipped a beat, and instinct overrode vengeance. She finished the suture loop, tied the knot with lightning speed, and checked for hemostasis. The field was dry. He was stable. Closing, she announced, peeling off her blood-soaked outer gloves. The tension in the room broke like a fever. The anesthesiologist exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding since the first incision. Zuri stepped back, watching the rise and fall of Dae-hyun's chest. The angry scar of the incision ran down his abdomen, a physical mark binding them together again. She felt exhausted, hollowed out, but the adrenaline was still spiking in her veins. She had saved the monster. The irony tasted like ash in her mouth. She stripped off her gown, tossing it into the biohazard bin with a wet slap. Take him to the ICU. Private wing. No visitors without my direct clearance. And tell his gorillas that if they bring a gun onto my floor again, I will personally overdose their boss on potassium chloride. She walked to the scrub sink, turning on the water as hot as she could stand it. She scrubbed her arms until the skin was raw and pink, trying to wash away the sensation of his blood, the memory of his eyes. She looked up at her reflection in the stainless steel dispenser. She looked the same, but something had shifted. The balance of power had inverted. He was alive because of her. He owed her a life. And this time, Zuri wasn't going to be the one who walked away empty-handed. She dried her hands, the rough paper towels scraping her skin, and turned to leave. But as she opened the door, she found the massive bodyguard waiting. He wasn't holding a gun this time. He bowed, deeply, respectfully. "The chairman is awake," the man rumbled. "He is asking for you." The recovery room was dim, lit only by the soft, rhythmic glow of the vitals monitor and the ambient city light filtering through the blinds. The storm outside had settled into a steady, weeping drizzle, the thunder distant now, like a retreating army. Kang Dae-hyun lay propped up against the pillows, his skin pale against the stark white hospital linens, tubes snaking from his arms and chest. He looked smaller than he had in the courtroom, diminished by pain and narcotics, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and focused entirely on Zuri as she entered the room. He didn't speak immediately. He just watched her, his gaze tracking her movement as she checked the fore-drip and the drain output, deliberately avoiding eye contact. The air between them crackled with unsaid words, a heavy, static tension that made the hair on Zuri's arms stand up. "You haven't aged," Dae-hyun said finally, his voice a rasping whisper that sounded like dry leaves sliding over stone. "You look exactly the same as the night you swore you'd kill me." Zuri didn't pause in her task. She scribbled a note on his chart, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. "And you look terrible," she replied coldly, finally turning to face him. She crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive barrier. "You lost a liter of blood. Your liver took a heavy hit. You're lucky the bullet missed the spine. But luck seems to be your specialty, doesn't it, Chairman? Luck and buying people off." Dae-hyun let out a short, pained laugh that turned into a cough. He winced, clutching his side. "It wasn't luck today, Dr. Kamara. It was you. I knew if anyone could fix this mess, it was you." He looked at her with a strange intensity, a flicker of regret warring with his natural arrogance. "Why did you do it? You could have let me die on that table. My men wouldn't have known. You could have claimed it was too severe. Why save the man who ruined you?" Zuri took a step closer to the bed, her shadow falling over him. "Because I am not you," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "Because unlike you, I don't trade lives like poker chips. I took an oath, Dae-hyun." Even for monsters, she leaned down, her face inches from his, her eyes searching his for any sign of the man she had once, briefly, foolishly, thought she knew before the betrayal. "But don't mistake my ethics for forgiveness. You owe me. You owe me 5 years of my life. You owe me my name." Dae-hyun held her gaze, the drug-induced haze in his eyes clearing for a moment of profound clarity. He reached out, his hand trembling, and grasped her wrist. His skin was hot, hers was cool. "I know," he whispered. "I know what I did. I had no choice then. The syndicate. They would have killed us both." He squeezed her wrist, a desperate anchor. "But things are different now. I can give it back, Zuri. I can give you everything back. The license, the reputation, the hospital. I own the board now." Zuri pulled her arm back as if burned. "I don't want your charity. I want the truth." Before Dae-hyun could answer, the lights in the room flickered. Once. Twice. Then the hospital plunged into total darkness. The hum of the ventilation died. The silence was absolute for a heartbeat, broken only by the terrifying beep of the backup battery on the monitor kicking in. Zuri spun toward the door. "The generator should have kicked in instantly," she hissed. Dae-hyun struggled to sit up, his face hardening, the pain replaced by a soldier's alertness. "It's not a power outage," he said, his voice turning to steel. "It's a hit. They're here to finish the job." The darkness in the VIP wing was not the comforting absence of light, but a heavy, suffocating blanket that smelled of ozone and impending violence. The red emergency strip lighting flickered into life, casting long, bloody shadows that danced along the corridor walls like specters of the dead. Zuri didn't waste a second. She grabbed a pair of surgical shears from the bedside table and shoved them into the pocket of her scrubs. "Can you walk?" she demanded, her voice a low vibration against the sudden silence of the hospital. Dae-hyun swung his legs over the side of the bed, his face a mask of sheer while suppressing agony. He gritted his teeth, sweat popping on his forehead as his abdominal muscles, recently sliced and sutured, screamed in protest. "I can walk," he grunted, though his knees buckled the moment his feet touched the cold linoleum. Zuri caught him, her shoulder jamming under his armpit, taking his weight with a deceptive strength honed by years of hauling cadavers and heavy equipment. They moved toward the door, the four-pole abandoned, dragging a trail of disconnected wires. Zuri cracked the door open a fraction. The hallway was empty, but the silence was wrong. The usual hum of the hospital night shift, the squeak of rubber saws, the distant paging system, the murmur of nurses, was gone, replaced by the distinct, wet thwip of suppressed gunfire from the nurses stationed down the hall. Dae-hyun's bodyguard, the giant who had threatened Zuri earlier, lay sprawled across the desk, a dark hole in the center of his forehead. "Professional," Dae-hyun whispered, his voice tight with pain and rage. "Viper Squad. They work for the politician who hired me to move the shipment. He's tying up loose ends." He looked at Zuri, his dark eyes burning with intensity in the crimson light. "Leave me. They want me. If you run the other way, you might live." Zuri tightened her grip on his waist, her nails digging into his patient gown. "I don't lose patience, Dae-hyun. Not to sickness, and not to hitmen. We're going to the freight elevator. Now." They moved through the shadows, a three-legged creature of desperation. Zuri navigated the labyrinthine corridors of St. Jude's with a mental map etched into her brain during her years of exile. She knew which doors squeaked, which stairwells were camera-blind, and which service corridors led to the bowels of the building. As they rounded the corner toward the service bay, a silhouette emerged from the gloom, a man in tactical gear, night vision goggles glowing green. He raised a silenced pistol. Dae-hyun tried to shove Zuri behind him, but he was too slow, too weak. Zuri, however, didn't freeze. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall mount in one fluid motion and hurled it. It wasn't an action movie throw. It was a desperate, adrenaline-fueled heave. The heavy metal canister smashed into the assassin's knee with a sickening crunch. As the man buckled, howling silently, Dae-hyun lunged, snatching the falling pistol out of the air and putting 2 bullets into the man's chest before he hit the ground. The hallway returned to silence, save for their ragged breathing. "You have a good arm," Dae-hyun wheezed, checking the magazine with trembling hands. Blood was seeping through his bandages, blooming like a red flower on his white gown. "Pathology requires upper body strength," Zuri replied curtly, dragging him toward the heavy steel doors of the service elevator. She swiped her badge. Thank God the internal readers still had battery backup, and the doors groaned open. They collapsed inside, Zuri hitting the button for the sub-basement. As the car descended, the metal rattling around them, the intimacy of the small space amplified the tension. Dae-hyun slid down the wall to a sitting position, his gun resting on his knee. He looked up at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the doctor he had wronged, but the warrior he was forced to rely on. "Why?" he asked again, the question hanging in the stale air. "You know I'm a criminal. You know I destroyed you. Why fight this hard?" Zuri looked at the floor numbers ticking down. "Because if they kill you here, they kill the truth. And I'm tired of the lies winning." The elevator doors parted to reveal the sub-basement, a realm of cold concrete, humming generators, and the sterile chill of the morgue. This was Zuri's kingdom. The air here was 10 degrees cooler, smelling of formaldehyde and dust. "The MRI suite is down the hall on the left," Zuri whispered, helping Dae-hyun to his feet. "It's the only room with a lock heavy enough to hold them off, and it has a dedicated phone line for technical support that bypasses the main switchboard." They shambled down the corridor, their footsteps echoing like thunder in the quiet. But as they reached the heavy, shielded door of the MRI room, the sound of boots on the stairs behind them grew louder. The assassins were efficient. They were sweeping the building floor by floor. They were trapped. Zuri shoved Daehyun into the control room, but instead of locking herself in with him, she moved toward the scanner room itself. "What are you doing?" Daehyun hissed, gripping the doorframe, his face gray. "Get in here." Zuri shook her head, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, calculated intelligence. "They have body armor. They have automatic weapons. You have one gun and a bleeding liver. We can't outshoot them. We have to outsmart them." She pointed to the massive, donut-shaped machine in the center of the glass-enclosed room. "That is a 3 Tesla magnet. It's always on. Even in a power outage, the superconductive cooling keeps the field active." She ran into the room, grabbing a heavy oxygen tank and positioning it precariously near the entrance, then sprinted back to the control room, locking the heavy door just as the stairwell burst open. 3 men in tactical gear flooded the hallway. They saw the closed door of the control room, the glass separating them from their targets. The lead assassin raised an assault rifle, preparing to shatter the reinforced glass. Zuri slammed her hand onto the intercom button. "I wouldn't step closer if I were you," she announced, her voice amplified and distorted by the speakers. The leader laughed, a muffled sound behind his mask. "Open the door, Dr. Kamara. Or we kill everyone in this basement." He signaled his men to breach the scanner room to flank them. It was exactly what Zuri had waited for. As the 2 men kicked open the door to the MRI chamber, stepping across the threshold with their rifles raised, physics took over. The magnetic field of a 3 Tesla MRI is 30,000 times stronger than the Earth's magnetic field. It is invisible, silent, and merciless to ferromagnetic metal. The moment the assassins stepped past the 5 Gauss line, the assault rifles were ripped from their hands with the force of a car crash, flying through the air and slamming into the bore of the magnet. The men were jerked forward, their tactical vests, laden with steel plates and ammunition, turning into anchors dragging them toward the machine. The oxygen tank Zuri had placed earlier became a missile, launching horizontally and pinning one of the men against the machine with a bone-shattering clang. The lead assassin in the hallway watched in horror as his team was neutralized by invisible giant hands. In the control room, Daehyun stared at Zuri, his mouth slightly open. "Remind me," he murmured, a terrified respect in his eyes, "never to piss you off in a room with heavy machinery." Zuri didn't smile. She was already moving to the back of the control room, to a nondescript filing cabinet hidden behind stacks of old hard drives. "The phone line is dead," she said, checking the receiver. "They cut the hard lines. But we don't need a phone. We need evidence." She unlocked the cabinet. Inside wasn't medical supplies, but a stack of pathology reports, hard drives, and physical samples, the insurance she had been gathering for 5 years. She pulled out a clear specimen bag containing a deformed, copper-jacketed bullet. She turned to Daehyun, holding it up like a holy relic. "This," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion, "is the bullet I pulled from the senator's son 5 years ago. The one you said didn't exist. The one the coroner lost, I kept it, along with the DNA analysis proving it came from a police-issue service weapon." Daehyun stared at the bullet. The silence in the room was heavy, weighted with the ghosts of the past. "You kept it," he whispered. "You knew they would come for you eventually." Zuri nodded, her eyes hard. "I knew you would come back. Or the people who own you." She tossed a thick file onto the console. "This isn't just about the senator's son. It's about the illegal organ harvesting ring operating out of the VIP wing. The ring you facilitate. The ring Director Park runs." Daehyun looked at the files, the undeniable proof of his own complicity, and then back at the woman who had saved his life twice in one night. The arrogance was gone. The criminal facade cracked. "The man who ordered the hit tonight," Daehyun said quietly, "is Senator Kim, the father of the boy. He runs the ring. He wanted me dead because I was asking for a bigger cut. He wanted you dead because you're the only loose end." He looked up, his expression resolute. "There is a broadcast server room on the roof. It controls the hospital's internal TV network and has a satellite uplink for medical conferences. If we get this up there, we can broadcast it to the entire city." The journey to the roof was a gauntlet of pain and adrenaline. They moved through the stairwells, avoiding the elevators which had become death traps. Daehyun was fading, his skin cold and clammy, his weight increasing on Zuri's shoulder with every step. But he kept moving, driven by a vindictive desire to burn down the masters who had betrayed him. They reached the roof access door, the wind howling outside, rain lashing against the metal. Zuri pushed the door open, and they stepped out into the storm. The helipad was awash in floodlights, the rain slicing through the beams like silver needles. Standing between them and the server room was the final obstacle, the corrupt handler himself, Senator Kim's personal fixers, a team of elite mercenaries surrounding a man in a trench coat, Director Park. Park looked pathetic and terrifying all at once, holding a pistol with shaking hands. "I'm sorry, Zuri," Park shouted over the roar of the wind and the thrum of a hovering news helicopter that had been circling the gang war below. "I have to do this. They'll kill my family." He raised the gun. Dae-hyun slumped against a ventilation unit, too weak to lift his weapon. Zuri stepped in front of him, shielding the Mafia boss with her own body. "You're not a killer, Park," she shouted back, her voice cutting through the storm. "You're a bureaucrat. You're a coward. But you're a doctor. Put it down." Park hesitated, tears mixing with the rain on his face. But the mercenary beside him didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle. Suddenly, a blinding spotlight hit them from above. The news helicopter dropped lower, sensing the climax of the drama. The intrepid reporter inside, seeing the standoff, zoomed the camera in. The feed was live. Millions of people in Seoul were watching their breakfast news, seeing the director of St. Jude's holding a gun on a wounded patient and a doctor. The mercenary faltered, realizing they were on camera. Zuri seized the moment. She held up the specimen bag with the bullet and the files, thrusting them toward the sky, toward the camera. "Senator Kim killed his own son," she screamed, her voice breaking with the force of the truth. "This is the evidence. This is the bullet." Director Park covered it up. The revelation, amplified by the visual of the desperate doctor and the dying mobster, was instantaneous. The mercenary lowered his weapon, realizing the operation was blown. Park collapsed to his knees, dropping the gun. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, converging on the hospital not as a rescue for the rich, but as a raid. Dae-hyun looked up at Zuri, at her silhouette framed against the blinding helicopter light and the stormy sky. She looked like a Valkyrie, an avenging angel of science and truth. He closed his eyes, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in years. The house of cards had fallen. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, police tape, and frantic questions. The sun had risen, bathing the wet streets of Seoul in a clean, golden light that felt incongruous with the violence of the night. Zuri sat on the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over her shoulders, watching the police lead Director Park away in handcuffs. The media circus was in full swing, cameras pointed at her, but she ignored them. Her work was done. The evidence was in the hands of the prosecutor. The senator had been arrested an hour ago, his immunity stripped by the undeniable public outcry. A gurney was wheeled past her. Dae-hyun lay on it, stabilized, handcuffed to the rail, but alive. He made the paramedics stop as they passed her. He looked different in the daylight, older, tired, stripped of his expensive armor. "You did it," he rasped, his voice weak but clear. "You burned it all down." Zuri looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I just cut out the infection," she said softly. "That's what doctors do." Dae-hyun nodded slowly. "I'm going to prison. For a long time. But my lawyers, they have instructions. The board is gutted. The hospital needs new leadership. I still own the majority share, through a shell company. I'm transferring my voting rights to you." Zuri's eyes widened. "I don't want your blood money." Dae-hyun, he smiled, a sad, crooked expression. "It's not money. It's penance. Make it a place where the best doctor handles the case, not the richest. Fix what I broke." He leaned back, signaling the paramedics to move on. As they wheeled him toward the police transport, he looked back one last time. "Thank you, Dr. Kamara, for saving the monster." Zuri watched him go, the heavy doors of the van slamming shut. She stood up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. She took a deep breath of the cool, rain-washed air. She was exhausted, bruised, and traumatized, but for the first time in 5 years, she was free. The underestimated expert had not only survived, she had rewritten the rules of the game. In a world built on lies, competence is the only revolution. Zuri Kumara proved that the sharpest weapon isn't a gun or a knife. It's the truth, wielded with surgical precision. But real life doesn't always have a surgeon to save the day. That's why you need to stay sharp, stay skilled, and never let them underestimate you. If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes justice, hit that like button, subscribe for more thrilling narratives, and let us know in the comments, would you have saved the enemy?